Portrait photography can be so fun and rewarding, and the options for creativity you have with portraits are endless. However, it can take a while to get really great at, and in my experience, there's one aspect that people struggle with the most. These are the best techniques I've learned for posing your subject, and with practice, it's something that will take your portraits to the next level. One of the things you're probably going for when taking a photograph is you want it to be eye-catching, and posing is a big part of that. Before I start this video, I just want to say that I don't think I'm some sort of posing genius or anything like that. I learn more every time that I pick up my camera, and I'm forever going to be continuing to learn, as that's just part of photography. It's part of any creative process. That being said, I've been shooting portraits for over a decade now, and I've learned a lot in that time, and I'd like to share some of those ideas with you. Now, some of these tips are things that can be practically applied, like the literal posing ideas I talk about later in the video, but first I just wanted to touch on some concepts that I don't really see talked about a lot that I think are very important, because it's going to help you and your subject just have a much more seamless experience. So to start this video off, I'm going to talk about some things that can help you and your subject get past any awkwardness and get into the flow of things more easily during the shoot. And then later in the video, I'll talk about some literal posing ideas. Anyways, let's get started. First off, if you're pretty new to posing people and you're not really sure where to start, there are two things that I would suggest doing. The first step is to start by building a mood board of poses that you like. There are many different ways to go about putting a mood board together, and it can even be as simple as just downloading the photos to your phone to use as reference during the shoot. The idea here is that when you start shooting, if you're not really entirely sure where to begin with your posing, you can just pick one from the mood board and use that as a jumping off point. And if you get stuck, you can just go back to the mood board and repeat. The second thing I'd recommend doing is getting a posing book. And maybe I'm just old school, or I spend way too much time looking at screens all day, but having a physical book for reference is just fantastic. You can use it to find ideas, get inspired, or what I actually used to do when I was starting out was I would actually bring this book with me to shoots, and the model and I would just sort of flip through it together looking for different posing ideas, and it was actually a really fun thing to do. So yeah, I would highly recommend getting a posing book because it's going to help you so much. If you're interested in the one that I use, it's called Photographing Women 1000 Poses. It's more geared towards fashion photography, but it's still totally relevant to portraiture. If you want to check it out, I've linked it in the description. Anyways, onward. Tip number 1, communication is key. So before we jump into the poses, there's something you need to think about before you and your subject even begin taking photos, and that is communication. Your first goal when you meet up with your subject is to create a relaxed environment where they can feel comfortable and enjoy themselves. Starting a conversation and chatting a bit while you're setting up your lights or while you're walking to your outdoor location is a great way to break the ice and make both parties feel a little more relaxed. Bonus points if you can find something to laugh about together, but the bottom line is you just want to have a bit of a human connection with this person before you start shooting, because then you've already got a bit of a rapport built up, and it's just going to make everything easier, because a happy, relaxed, and above all comfortable subject is going to be less stiff and less self-conscious in front of the camera. Further on communication, you never want to talk through your camera like this. You always want to lower the camera and make eye contact with the subject when you're trying to communicate something to them. As photographers, we get really comfortable with having this thing in front of our face all the time, but it can feel kind of weird for people and make you harder to understand. So you and your subject have talked for a bit and are both feeling a little more relaxed with one another. Now it's time to start snapping photos. While you're shooting, it's really great practice to make sure you're letting your subject know when you're getting great shots. One of the biggest complaints I hear from models about other photographers is when they're really quiet or even silent during shoots. Your subject can't read your mind, so you need to encourage them when you're getting shots that you like. Get excited about it and they'll get excited about it. If you're not happy with the current pose, just casually change it. Positive reinforcement goes a long way. Tip number 2, don't be afraid to be wrong. You'll get more comfortable with this the more that you shoot, but there's this feeling that we get as photographers where when we're shooting with somebody, we feel like we need to be seen as super professional and not making any mistakes, especially if it's in a client setting. Yet every shoot, I find myself coming up with a few posing ideas that seem great in my head at the time, but once we try shooting it, it just does not work at all. And that's fine. You're trying new ideas in the moment, and it's always great to try things out when the inspiration hits, but don't put too much pressure on yourself. Whenever I find myself in this situation, I just confidently say something like, I have no idea why I thought that would work. Let's try something else. And we have a laugh about it and move on. You do want your subject to know and feel that you are comfortable behind the camera, but admitting when one of your ideas isn't working out doesn't undermine that. Quick disclaimer, if you're shooting for a client and they're in the room or they're the subject themselves, maybe use your intuition and decide if it's best to keep that to yourself or not. Tip number 3, help them see what you see. Our last tip on communication is my favorite, and that is to let your subject know why you're asking them to do what you're asking them to do. Now, you don't have to do this for every single movement, but I have been told by people that they really like when I explain to them why I'm asking them to do certain things. For example, instead of saying, point your nose over here, you could say, point your nose over here so we get a little bit more light on this side of your face. Explaining to your subject why you're asking them to move in a certain way will help them to understand what you see and what your goals are. And I even find that a lot of the time, after a little bit of doing this, my subject will kind of just naturally start to pick up on what I'm after and begin posing themselves, and it just makes everything easier. In addition, showing your subject the photos you're getting during the shoot also helps them to see what you see. And once they see what they look like in frame, they may even come up with some posing ideas you wouldn't have thought of yourself. Another quick note on this subject is I find that it's really beneficial to kind of demonstrate the poses as you're asking your subject to do them. Don't be afraid to step into the light, hit a pose, and show your subject what you want. I find that I do this all the time when I'm asking for a pose. It just makes it click a lot easier. If you're asking somebody to do a pose and you kind of demonstrate it, it makes it easier. All right, so that about sums it up for communication. Now we're gonna get into some posing. When I'm shooting, personally, I like to start with some more casual poses, and then once we've built up some momentum, then we get into a little bit more creative things. For this reason, I like to start with standing poses. By far the most easy and commonly used posing in portrait photography are standing poses. This includes regular standing, leaning on something, shifting the body weight, or using props. With your standing poses, moving the arms is a great place to start because it can quickly get your subject out of a regular standing pose and into something a little more dynamic. To get started, have your subject stand where you'd like to shoot and simply ask them to cross their hands in front of them. Next, using the shoulder is an underutilized but interesting gesture. Ask your subject to raise their shoulder toward the light source, then you could have them turn their cheek towards their shoulder to create more of a mood. This is okay, but we can do more. Maybe we ask our subject to lift their other hand toward their elbow. Notice how the more the arms do, the more of a mood we evoke. A quick note on hands. I love using hands in my photos, but they can look really weird really quickly if they're not positioned properly. I find that remembering 2 key things when I'm posing with hands typically yields good results, and that is relaxed wrists with loose fingers and breaking the fingers up. Having the fingers all together or kind of closed off can look odd. But if we relax the hands and break the fingers apart, it can look a lot more appealing. Anyways, back to the standing poses. We can have our subjects standing straight, experimenting with different positions for the arms. We can ask them to cross their feet or shift their weight from one hip or the other. One of the best ways to maintain an interesting standing pose is having your subject lean on something. This can be anything from a wall to leaning on the air itself. Another standing pose I like is having the subject gaze over their shoulder. They can look directly at the camera, off into the distance, or one of my favorites is asking the subject to turn their head to the side, then look down at the ground past their shoulder. There's so much variety you can get with standing poses, but the main takeaways are to remember to have your subject shift their body weight and to use their arms. Next, we'll talk about a type of posing that can make your photos feel a lot more dynamic and captivating. Adding movement to your photos can require a lot of trial and error, as by its very nature it can't be captured in just one shot, but it can help your image feel a lot more alive. Start by having your subject shift their weight from one foot to the other, swaying side to side. Oftentimes, the best shots are captured in the nuances between two positions. Get the body in motion by asking your subject to spin, walk, jump into the air, and so on. We're not just looking for body movement, but movement in the hair and clothing also add to the dynamic feel to our photograph. Having your subject sit down is a great way to immediately help them relax in front of the camera. We can have our subject sit on furniture, on the floor or ground, on steps or stairs, or basically anything a person can sit on. When your subject is sitting, just remember to pay attention to what they're doing with their arms, hands, face, and legs in order to maintain an interesting image. We can have them sit like this, or we can have them sit like this. I don't do a lot of crouching or kneeling poses as it's more on the fashion side of things, so I've lumped them together to make this one a little quicker. A good rule of thumb with crouching poses is to keep the angle of your camera low to match your subject's eye level. But if you're familiar with my channel, you know that I love preaching about experimenting with different kinds of creative angles, so maybe scrap that rule. When crouching, we can have our subject in a balanced, knees wide position. We can have them shift their body weight as we have with previous poses. We can have them lean while crouching or even use their hands. Next, we're onto a type of posing that is really fun, but more easily achieved if your subject is comfortable in front of the camera or naturally very comfortable moving their body like a dancer. Using exaggerated poses can make our shot less mundane and can add emotion or drama to the image. Essentially, to create an exaggerated pose, just take any of the posing tips from earlier and, well, exaggerate them. For example, if your subject is shifting their weight to one hip, have them shift it way over. Instead of crossing their feet, have them cross their entire legs. If they're sitting down, have them get their feet or hands into positions that they would never normally be in. If they're leaning on something, have them put all of their body weight into it. The further you can push it, the more captivating your shots will be. Lastly, we're going to cover what I think is the most difficult aspect of posing. While your success with achieving this is largely dependent upon your subject's self-awareness, self-confidence, and ability to do so, you can really help the process by using my tips on communication earlier in this video to make sure that your subject feels comfortable, safe, and relaxed. So at this point you may be thinking emotion isn't a pose. I would disagree. I always prioritize capturing some form of emotion in my subject's face whenever possible, and all other posing after that is secondary. The emotion isn't just conveyed by the subject, but also the makeup, clothing, hair, angle of your camera, and the lighting used play a major role in conveying whatever emotion you're going for. Since this isn't a lighting video, I'm going to focus on the aspect that fits most in line with posing itself, which is the expression. It's important with portrait photography that your subject's face connects with the viewer and that the viewer believes what they're seeing is real. Capturing the right expression will make sure this happens. Some posing ideas for expressions are unwelcome attention, vulnerability, cold and calculating, calm confidence, agitation, lost in thought. Again, your subject's ability to convey these emotions with their expression will vary from person to person, but regardless how naturally inclined to this they are, making sure that they're comfortable and relaxed will help them to convey those emotions better. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I hope that you got something out of it. I know that posing is really tough, especially when you're starting out. It can be really difficult to get comfortable with that, but with practice, you can get good at it. So anyways, have a great week, everybody. Hard cut.